the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which, as you know, was agreed on 2015 during the year that the couple of years that many of the global agendas were renewed with the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement for Climate Change, kind of looking forward to a more complex world with increasingly integrated challenges, and kind of seeing how more collaboration, more engagement, and more multi-level governance was necessary to achieve those shared goals for a more sustainable and inclusive future. So if we look more in detail into the Sendai framework for disaster risk reductions, we see that it identifies 4 priority areas that apply both for the national or local level. So it talks about understanding disaster risk, and that's kind of part of what we were doing in the first half. Like, how do we conceptualize disaster risk? How we understand it? Like going beyond the general conception of a natural disaster from like just hitting us from out of nowhere, but seeing that it's something that is ingrained in the systems and in the cities that we developed, and how we are the ones who are creating cities, but creating risk by the different exposure that we build in the cities, or the lack of preparations in the systems that we built. The second, so like understanding disaster risk would be the first priority area. The second one is strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. So also understanding how, you know, a shock or a stress not only affects a specific, you know, department or like a specific territory, it usually will have impacts across the city and usually beyond borders. So it needs a lot of coordination and governance mechanisms that go beyond the isolated city or the national level, and kind of helps to facilitate the communication with clear competences and resources between the different levels of governance and across territories, so within a metropolitan area or between the neighboring cities or regions. So this is the second priority that we talked about. And also another important part here is even beyond the government levels, how do we engage the community in that governance of resilience? And how do we make sure that they are also involved in that, in the decisions that the private sector is doing in terms of development, the communities are doing, and how they work in their communities. So governance across all different levels. The third priority is investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. So integrating DRR as part of the investments that the different levels of governments are doing, so that they include the different risks, and especially now with climate change trends, that they understand that if they are investing in a road, the risk might increase in 10 years later. The risk for flooding, for landslides might be higher, and that we can include in those investments disaster risk reduction, and we also invest on adaptation to climate change and reinforcing the systems that we realize are under increasing risk or stress. And the second priority, which I think it was something that was mentioned by many of you in the self-introduction, is building back better and enhancing preparedness. So even when we understand risk, we increase the governance to kind of improve our development and avoid exposure and invest in disaster resilience. There might be cases where the shock that hits us goes beyond what could be expected or what was identified as a need, as a priority. So being prepared to respond, making sure that the community is aware of the risk that they are exposed to if there haven't been investments to reduce or to protect from those risks, seeing how people can evacuate, shelter, how the civil defense can respond to that, and then how do we build back better without falling into the same exposure and risks that we have. So those are the 4 priority action areas identified by the Sendai framework. And it also has 7 targets. It was mentioned in the video that target E was very important for cities and local governments because it includes a clear mention of the number of countries with national and local DRR strategies. So the Sendai framework kind of has a very complex and kind of comprehensive understanding of disaster risk reduction. And as part of the targets, the countries are kind of invited to also facilitate the creation of local strategies for disaster risk reduction. So many national governments are now kind of working with local governments to make sure that there's a kind of legal framework so that local governments can create those their strategies or facilitating resources or kind of capacities to organize this. So this so these are the 7 targets: reducing mortality, a number of affected people, economic loss, and damage to critical infrastructure and service disruption. This one is also actually very important for local governments in terms of service provision, something that has been made clear during the pandemic. Kind of the provision of public services is an important responsibility of local governments. So that there's also a big role for cities to play here. And then the increasing the number of countries with their strategies, international cooperation to developing countries, and availability and access to early warning systems. Something that I know that in the Asia Pacific region, it has advanced a lot in terms of collaboration across governments for tsunami alerts, earthquake, and things like that. Now, as I was mentioning, the Sendai framework was kind of created or kind of agreed in 2015, and it was followed by several agendas. So, sometimes when we were creating this module, we were like, we've been working in sustainable development goals with different sections and governments for a long time. And if we have we have the Sendai, we have the climate change, and for local governments who are responding to the day-to-day public service provision to their communities, it sometimes feels like it's too much responsibility to carry over. But it's important to see how these 3 and like also the new urban agenda and this kind of post-COVID recovery kind of relate to each other, and there are different synergies within them. So the sustainable development goals, which target in principle, creating kind of decreasing poverty, increasing or reinforcing equality, like more kind of protecting nature, creating more inclusive kind of development and economic systems, will help to reduce a lot of the vulnerabilities and stresses that we have identified in the previous exercise. So we see here the different SDGs. One of them is, as several of them actually make clear reference to resilience as part of the target, goal 11 on sustainable cities and communities. But also when we talked about the infrastructure, they make a clear mention of resilience infrastructure. When we talk about zero hunger, also we talk about the resilience of food systems and like food security and food sovereignty. So like the different goals include targets where resilience is an important part of the way of building sustainable development. And also we will look at this tomorrow in more detail, but the SDG principles of leaving no one behind, thinking of it in an integral way, going through a partnership-based approach, through multi-level governance, and kind of making sure that we are accountable and we monitor the progress, are principles that also apply to resilience building. Of course, when we talked about the Paris Agreement, especially the part on adapting to climate change is very closely linked to resilience building. So it's kind of looking beyond our current risk and our current trends of how much rain is how much rain do we expect, how much typhoons, but we cannot expect that to be the same 5 years later. And we have to kind of start reinforcing the resilience, looking into those trends in the future, while working to mitigate climate change, making sure that while we are protecting from those increasing trends, we are not kind of helping make them continue increasing. And that's a lot of an important role to play in kind of local development. And the New Urban Agenda, of course, kind of on with all of the policies at the national and local level of how cities should be developed and what kind of tools are available for local governments to guide their planning. It's a very important agenda also for local governments.